And we are back with another session in our Ecclesiastes Bible study. This, I believe, is the fourth session, and we are beginning to dive into chapter 2. So, hopefully you've got your Bible in front of you. You've got something you can write with. That would also be very helpful. Before we dive into chapter 2, I want to just do a quick review. So Ecclesiastes, we've got our main character, Qoheleth, or Qoheleth. The preacher is a good English translation, but again, you can go watch the previous sessions. We could translate that a number of different ways. So for most of the time, we'll be using the Hebrew as a loan word and just saying Qoheleth. So he's introduced, and he's this great man, a person of wisdom, putting on the kind of aura of Solomon. Not literally, probably not literally Solomon, but most likely the author wants us to think of Solomon. And he is on this great search for substance and for meaning. And we see that there are actually two voices in Ecclesiastes. There's this third person voice that describes Qoheleth and introduces him to us. But then in chapter 1, verse 12, we see Qoheleth speaks in first person. So we have the first person remembrances, reflections, thoughts, conclusions of Qoheleth, all the way to chapter 12, through verse 7 of chapter 12, and then 12 verses 8 through 14, we go back to third person. And so we can have two different voices here. And I'm inclined to think that we do, that someone has taken this Qoheleth character and they are using his sayings, his writings, his observations, his conclusions, his wisdom to make a point, an apologetic against just thinking about life merely under the sun, but arguing for life has meaning and substance when we walk in covenant relationship with Yahweh. So, little bit of introduction there. We're kind of getting our feet wet here, wading into his Qoheleth's search for substance and for meaning. It's already begun. Now in chapter 2, we continue to dive into it. And we want to remember that the phrase under the sun, or under heaven, or on the earth, those three are synonymous. The one we're going to see the most often is under the sun is key because it sets our parameters. We're only thinking about the world in a materialistic way. We have Qoheleth has removed the divine perspective, and he's simply thinking about the natural, material world. Now, in chapter 2, we get both an interesting chapter and one that doesn't really end on a high note. But we kind of break it down. So section 1 would be verses 1 through 11. This is kind of searching for this substance, for this meaning through pleasure. And then in verses 12 through 17, we have that Qoheleth considers the end of all people, that now death has entered the picture in his search. And then verses 18 through 23, he continues this search, thinking about work. And then in verses 24 through 26, a conclusion is formed. And this is the beginning, those verses are at the beginning of a theme that runs consistently throughout, and it pops up not really at regular intervals, but it pops up consistently throughout Ecclesiastes. So we're going to jump in. Hopefully you got your Bible in front of you. We're going to read the first section right now. I'm reading out of the ESV. Again, this is chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. This is what Qoheleth writes. He says, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. For my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it. And behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Doesn't that just put you in a great mood? So here we have that Qoheleth is diving headfirst into pleasure. And the ESV actually has a little subheading note that says the vanity of self-indulgence. And self-indulgence is really the theme or one of the themes of this section, because all of this is self-absorbed, selfish pleasure. Qoheleth has put himself at in the middle of this. And this is seen, a lot of these writings are seen as reflections. He's thinking back, which aligns with the traditional view that Solomon wrote this in his old age, that he's looking back on his life and looking through everything and reflecting as now an older, wiser man who has returned to the Lord. Qoheleth is doing the same type of reflection. I don't know how orthodox his conclusions are going to be. But verse 1 is really the heading of this section. It says, "Come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself." But behold, this was also vanity. As Qoheleth always says, hey, this is what I'm going to do. Here's the conclusion before I ever describe, how I searched for pleasure or through work or I thought through death. He usually gives us the conclusion first. So it's kind of a spoiler alert. But it is to emphasize the futile nature of his search for substance and for meaning under the sun. Remember, we've removed the divine perspective. And in this, he's probably going through two types of pleasure. So if we look in verse 2, the ESV and most of our English translations have laughter and then pleasures, the two types of pleasure. And so this is really thinking through all of the forms of pleasure. So laughter is talking about like fleeting, light, frivolous, goofy, you're just being dumb with your friends kind of pleasure. And the second word, and of pleasure, that is like a deeper pleasure. That word is used to describe the kind of pleasure from religious festivals or the ordination of a new king, kind of more like substantial life events. But the conclusion that Qoheleth draws is of laughter, so these fleeting, frivolous pleasures, it is mad. Mad in the sense that it would be mad to ascribe substance to that kind of pleasure. It is what it is. There's nothing underneath it. There's nothing deeper to it. And then to these kind of more substantial forms of pleasure, what use is it? What have I gained from it? Like, what have I accomplished? When it's over, what am I left with? Pleasure is only good kind of in the moment. That is one of his conclusions. And then in verse 3, he says, hey, I searched with my heart to cheer my body with wine. So he's This is, I'm going to live the party lifestyle. And sometimes we try to make Qoheleth a little more holy than he is, but I think we need to take these verses as they come to us with, he is still pursuing, he is still using his wisdom and his mental faculties to explore and search for meaning and substance, but boy's getting drunk. He's living the party lifestyle to see, hey, is there substance to this? Is there true meaning to this? Is this truly satisfactory? And so then in verses 4 through 10, we have that he is not only living the party lifestyle, saying, hey, what outside substance can I bring into my body to give me more pleasure? But he, with alcohol being the main medium of his day, but he's also built this whole world of pleasure for himself. And I think commentators rightly see kind of allusions to the Garden of Eden in here, that this Qoheleth has built his own paradise for himself, and he fills it with everything that you can have. He fills it with all of his wealth. He fills it with people to serve on him and provide for his every need. He even fills it with concubines. And so we have all the pleasures. We've got partying, we've got money, we've got alcohol, we've got sex. Qoheleth has, again, dove head first into the world of pleasure, searching for some substance and for some meaning. But in verse 11, we get his conclusion. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. There was no profit to be had. There was no substance. There was no lasting satisfaction. And that conclusion that he comes to is that hedonism usually just makes the appetite grow. It just makes you need more. It doesn't really satisfy you. Of course, hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure, doesn't really satisfy you, and that is his unfortunate conclusion. So he continues this search, and we have this new section here in verses 12 through 17, and I'm actually going to read Tremper Longman's translation. This is in the New International Commentary on the Old Testament. Ecclesiastes, I think his commentary of this section is really, or his translation of this section is very, very helpful. So read along in your Bible. This is verses 12 through 17. It says, I turned my attention to observe wisdom and mad folly. For what can anyone who comes after the king do but that which has already been done? I observed there was more profit to wisdom than folly, like the profit of light over darkness. The wise have eyes in their head, while fools walk around in darkness. But I also understand that the same fate awaits them both. I said to myself, even I will meet the same fate as the fool. Why, then, have I become so wise? So I said to myself, this too is meaningless. For the memory of neither the wise nor the fool endures forever. The days arrive only too soon when both will be forgotten. How will the wise person die? Like the fool. So I hated life, for the work that is done under the sun is evil to me. Indeed, all is meaningless and a chasing of the wind. I think that Longman captures the mood, the tone, so well in his translating of this section. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to read it for us. But he's really cool as asking this question. What real advantage does wisdom give you? Everybody dies. Again, we are looking under the sun here. We are not taking into account any kind of divine perspective, any kind of belief or statement on the afterlife at all. We are just looking at the materialistic world and materialistic pursuits of humans. And he says, what advantage is my wisdom? Like, I worked so hard to become wise, but the fool dies. I'm going to die. We have the same end. So what's the point? in verse 12, he says, look, I have searched so that no one can do any more than me. Nobody can come after me and add to what I've done. I have searched it out. And we also see here a common theme in wisdom literature. Proverbs is another example of wisdom literature we have in Scripture of wisdom versus folly. And so we have the contrasting of the wise person versus the fool. And Qoheleth admits wisdom has some advantage. When we're talking about simply living a materialistic lifestyle, thinking about just this life, just in this world, wisdom, it has some advantage because light has advantage over dark. This is the analogy that he's using in verse 14. He says wise people, literally, they have eyes in their head, and fools don't. And so it's that wise people, they can navigate life effectively, while fools can't because they don't have any wisdom. They can't make good decisions. They run into barriers and they fall into pits and they get trapped and snared. Wise people avoid those things. So there's some benefit. He admits that. But he says, well, what's the gain? What's the substantial profit? There isn't any, because the wise person dies. Just like, how does the wise person die? Like the fool. They both have the same end. And so he goes in verse 17, and it's this, so I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous. ESV does grievous, and it lightens the meaning a little bit, but I think that Longman is probably a little more accurate and says, done under the sun is evil. That maybe there might be some accusation towards God even. Again, think about the book of Job, right? And so it's despair. That's the emotion, that's the tone, that's the mood. That is just the, wisdom's got some benefit, but wait. Yeah, we're all going to die. We all die. Fools, wise persons, they all die. So what's the point? In verse 16, it says, the memory fades just the same. Like all this wisdom that I amass, I wait long enough, no one's going to remember it. So where's meaning in that? It's futility. So we go to the next section, verses 18 through 23, and we see that Qoheleth is again on this search for substance, for meaning. And now he's looking through work. This is a universal experience of all humans. We have to work, and work isn't necessarily this terrible, terrible thing. Work can be very enjoyable. So reading verses 18 through 23, he says, I hated all my toil, in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. So we see that the mood of despair has continued. Because Qoheleth, he's thinking about, okay, so I have done all these great things. And again, he's writing under kind of the guise of Solomon. Who built more than Solomon, right? Who had a more majestic reign than Solomon? No other king of Israel. But what happened to it? And there isn't necessarily an allusion to Rehoboam in here. Rehoboam was Solomon's son. Rehoboam's the one who split the kingdom. The reason you had the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, because Rehoboam was an idiot. He was dumb. The story is that so Solomon dies, Rehoboam comes king, and this guy named Jeroboam, who's a representative of the 10 tribes in the north, comes to Rehoboam. He's like, look, your dad made us work real hard. And we have been working very hard, and the burden on us is great. If you will lift the burden a little bit off of our shoulders and ease your work requirements, we will serve you faithfully. And so Rehoboam asked his father's old counselors and advisors. He said, hey, what do you think I should do? And they're like, you should do that. Do that thing. Ease the burden on them, and you're going to have a very long and fruitful and happy reign, and the kingdom will flourish. And Rehoboam was like, okay. And so, but then he went and asked all his friends. They were his age, his buddies, and they were like, nah, this is your opportunity, Rehoboam, to assert yourself, to prove that you're the man and that they are going to do what you say. And Rehoboam's like, that sounds like much more fun. And so he goes back to Jeroboam and those men representing those 10 tribes, and he says, yeah, here's what's going to happen. You thought my dad made you work hard? My pinky finger is thicker than my dad's thigh. And this is probably, I'm bigger than my dad. And so I'm going to make you work harder. And then the kingdom split. Jeroboam was like, no, we're not going to do that. And so they split off, and you had the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And so Solomon, literally in his story, like everything that he had built, he left it to someone who did not toil for it, and that boy ruined it all. And so because we're meant to think Solomon, that might be what we're meant to think here, to see that in here. Even if we're not, it's a good illustration of what Qoheleth is talking about. He's like, look, I have toiled. And I love the ESV is staying very close to the way the Hebrew is written. That's why we see the word toil so much, because that's how the Hebrew reads. And so in English, it's a little, it's odd. It sounds odd to our ears, but this gives us some more insight into this emphasis of frustration and futility. But again, there's, you toil, and ultimately you get nothing. And it's not even fair, because you do all this hard work and you build these great things, and then there's someone who comes after you who didn't have to work for any of it, and they get it. Like, that's meaningless. That's pointless. Like, there's no substance to that. That is not satisfactory. No. So this isn't like a lighthearted, oh, well, I guess we'll just keep on going. This is despair. The preacher cannot find anything that will endure under the sun. So then we get kind of to our first real conclusion here in verses 24 through 26. And I'm going to read these, and you read them, and there's kind of two different ways to interpret this passage. We'll talk about that. Verse 24, he says, there is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. So there's two ways to look at this. You can look at this as a positive. God has entered the picture, and something positive is taking place. There is some positive conclusions you can draw to life under the sun. If you're going to allow kind of God to peek in a little bit. The other way to interpret is that you look at that last sentence. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. And you take the opposite approach of, no, this is like a concession, but still nothing satisfactory has been concluded. Um, and so I take the second interpretation, and this is why. In verse 24, it starts off, there's nothing better. It's kind of like, resignation, unwillingly admitting, yeah, I guess, like, there's some enjoyment, or there's a little bit of meaning or substance or good in, just eat, drink, find enjoyment. Eat, drink, and be merry is the classic English interpretation of that. And it is important that God has been talked about. We have not seen that happen lately, and so God enters the picture, and maybe, and this is a new theme. This pops up, and it pops up in other places throughout Ecclesiastes. Again, not in any kind of like a regular interval, but it is repeated more times. And really the thought or the idea, the meaning here is that, look, if all we've got is under the sun, if all we've got is the materialistic world, then anything beyond just enjoying the moment and enjoying the simple pleasures of life is futile. We're not going to find any kind of substance or any kind of deeper meaning there, or purpose that is going to satisfy us if this materialistic world is all that we have. This is the best that we can do. And I think that is indeed Qoheleth's conclusion here, but he's still not satisfied with it. He's still like, no, this isn't it. There's got to be something more. So the search continues. The search goes on, and we will pick that up in our next section in chapter 3, which chapter 3 starts with one of the most recognized, or maybe not recognized, but quoted passages in the Bible. And people might quote it and not know where it's coming from. They might think it comes from a song, but it's from Ecclesiastes. But before we go, okay, so for us, like, let's not just end on this like low note, like, well, I guess, we can settle for this. But I think of two things. One, I think of what Jesus said. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Thinking about what do you really gain if you're super rich, you have everything you want, you have every pleasure that you can think of under the sun. What do you really gain? Because you forfeited your soul in the process. And I think a solid conclusion we can come to is that the materialistic pursuit of accomplishment and pleasure is futile. That there is no deeper reward, there's no lasting satisfaction in that. And this is important because we live in a modern American society that is continuing to double down on this pursuit of self-absorption, self-expression, self-determination. Everything revolves around the self, and everything revolves around right now. This is all that we have, and a divine or eternal perspective has been removed, and we're even becoming more and more relativistic in our thinking, meaning we are removing objective standards or morality as well. And so all we're left with is just the right now. And as Christians, we know that that's not it. That we have to be looking from an eternal, a divine perspective, because only through being brought back into relationship with God can we find that substance, that meaning. And so let's remember that and be reminded of that, but also understand that what Qoheleth is writing is just as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago.